Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Within with Dr. Azadeh Katibi. Today we have a fantastic guest, Natalia Murakhver. She is here to talk about a film that she has produced and directed called 15 Days, the real story of America's pandemic school closures. You're going to be able to see it on all the streaming platforms. She's been working on it for 3 years. The response has been incredible, and people are saying all sorts of great things about this. I'm delighted to have her on today to tell you about this amazing woman. Natalia Murakhver is a documentary filmmaker, writer, and co-founder of Restore Childhood, a nonprofit dedicated to children's health and education and parental rights. She writes for the New York Post and her Substack called Restore Childhood. She's a Soviet immigrant who came to America at age 6. She founded the hashtag Keep New York Schools Open movement during the pandemic, and she filed a lawsuit against Mayor de Blasio to reopen New York schools, which became the origin story of her documentary, 15 Days, which is now streaming. And her current mission, which she's going to talk to us about today, is to get this film seen by every parent in America and inoculate, as it were, the families with the truth so they can push back against indoctrination and reclaim their child's futures. I am super excited to have Natalia on today. Thank you so much for being here, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Azadeh. You were one of the first people to have ever seen this film. So it's really kind of cool to be here.
Yeah, we met in person for the first time at the USC Censorship in the Sciences Conference, and you premiered kind of a first cut or second cut. I don't know what cut you were at that time.
Very rough.
But it was beautifully done. You just call it rough, but we, felt the emotions of it as we were watching it and kind of reliving what happened during COVID and what happened to our children during COVID. And I'm so, so glad that now you've had other iterations of the film and you've released it and you've had doing this big push now to promote it. So a few things people are saying about your film is an agonizing anatomy of a public policy scandal. That was the Jewish Journal. The Christian Post said, major props to Murakhver for painstakingly telling the story. And you've got an IMDb rating of 8.7 out of 10. So that's a great rating. So tell us, why this film? Why did you make it?
Well, I couldn't not make it. I felt that it was almost like a calling during the school closures. I felt that so much had been taken away from our children and from our families too, that it was incumbent upon us, every single one of us, to try to restore our families and our children as much as possible. And if we don't know our history, if someone else, the perpetrators of the crime, write the history, then they have robbed us twice. And so as a result, I had to preserve these stories. I had incredible access to doctors, to free speech attorneys, to parents and children around the country just through my advocacy work in 2020 through 2022. So it was just a natural thing to, get a camera, bring my friend Stephanie Edmonds, who worked with me on the film from the very beginning, and go on the road and capture as many of these stories as possible. And we did. We did it for about 2 years. We were filming. The film itself took over 3 years, 3.5 years to finally get released, which I'm told is pretty quick for a first film. And I'm really glad we did it because we could never get the kind of access to these incredible voices now like we did back then. I mean, we spent several days interviewing Jay Bhattacharya, who, as you know, is now the head of the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. So his calendar is no longer his own. So I just feel like that's treasure that we were able to capture, and we have so much more footage than is in this film.
I know and I feel, even as you're saying it, like the intensity and the drive that you have and the drive that you felt at that time, and we were feeling it as well, like the sense of urgency
Yes.
to do something. And I really liked the fact that what you said about, they've robbed us twice is something that really resonated with me, because we want to make sure that we're writing and keeping and safeguarding the history from our perspective and what we saw, what we went through, what our children went through, because the wounds of that are going to last potentially generations, because the wounding, the tension, the anxiety a child feels, or the thwarted intellect, the thwarted potential a child has, also affects their success as
Mm.
adults. And then that affects how they parent and what resources they have to give to their children, and the intellect, and then the tension that they present to their own parenting. So it is something, to me, when I look at it, that's multi-generational effects. So one of the things I found was interesting was you talked about the Shoah Project, Steven Spielberg's Shoah Project, as part of the
Mm.
inspiration. And you said bearing witness is a moral obligation. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm a Soviet Jew. We left with almost nothing, my parents and I, when I was 5. We were legal immigrants. We came through Austria and then Ostia, Rome, Italy, where we spent several months waiting to get clearance to be brought into this country. We didn't cross a border illegally. My parents painstakingly waited and filled out the forms and did everything they could, and we finally got here in the winter of 1977. And my entire life, I've been told about why they left. Nobody wants to be an immigrant. I mean, I will. Maybe there are some, but they're affectionately called expats. I mean, that my husband is an expat. He's from the UK. He didn't escape the UK, although now he probably would be an immigrant. He probably should be given asylum. But for us, it was my parents trying to protect my future and the future generations. They knew that not only did Soviets who weren't Jewish have very little prospect in that country, but if you were a Jew and that was in your on your passport, it was over. That it was just there was no future ahead. And I think both of my parents are very optimistic, hardworking people, and they really believed that if they worked hard and enabled me to do the same, I should have a future. And so them bringing me here and helping me through every stage of my life. I've been very fortunate with my education and support in every way possible. It has given me a profound obligation to return that. And to me, the only way I could think of doing it beyond the advocacy for the children at open schools is through film and preservation. I've always been a film lover. It's been my favorite artistic medium. I'd never made a film before, but I remember reading about Steven Spielberg's drive to make the Shoah films. And I think he said something along the lines of the Holocaust survivors won't be here forever. This
Right.
is a unique opportunity while they're still alive. If I don't capture those stories now, they'll be gone forever. And that profound sense of loss and time, the ticking clock, the sands, I felt it the entire time the tragedy was happening to our children. I felt, there's an urgency now. People want to talk about it now. I lived in New York City during 9/11. I've been in New York most of my life. And I remember 9/11 was incredibly traumatic for me. And for about 6 months after 9/11, all I wanted to talk about was the trauma. That's all.
Yeah.
I was not interested in any other conversation. I looked at it from every angle. Who did it? Why did they do it? Why us? What am I going through right now? What are other people? Like, how is it different in other places? Every angle, like I examined it. But after 6 months, I never wanted to talk about it again. I still
Mm.
don't really want to talk about it. I don't want to read about it. I want that all closed and put away. It's a put away in a box. And I was concerned, and I think I was right, that the COVID debacle and the school closures and the pandemic would be the same sort of trauma in this nation's history, and that people would no longer want to be able to share their stories if we didn't get to them as quickly as possible. So in some ways, it was almost like a triage. We were running to the scene of the crime and interviewing the eyewitnesses and the victims to see what they had to say. And I think as a result, the film is strong and fresh and immediate.
You and I were talking before this interview about how that sense of urgency and people talking about it sometimes can be waning because there's something else in the news cycle that then takes other people's attention. But if you haven't processed and understood and explored like you did, for example, with 9/11 for 6 months, what actually happened, what went on. And of course, our investigations of 9/11 are still, for some communities and some groups, ongoing to get more answers. But if that doesn't happen and people just go on to the next news cycle, there's no processing and resolution that happens. And then we repeat the past over and over again because we haven't learned. And then when we don't talk about things, the next generation can easily get duped. I think about that with Iran right now and what's going on in the United States, where especially non-Iranian youth have a very different perspective than what the Iranian diaspora have, because we, as members of that community, did not tell the stories. And for whatever reason, we were trying to establish ourselves. There were some stories that were told, books that were written, some films that were made, but it was not this consistent, concerted effort that created a foundation such that outside propaganda that I think is probably from outside influences, and then also people here in the States who have a different agenda, couldn't have created a counter to our perspective, so that it would be like obvious to people that, oh, of course the Islamic Republic is bad. But we didn't do that enough. We didn't tell those stories. And unfortunately, then we're kind of repeating some past patterns. And so I think what you're doing in terms of chronicling this is so, so important.
Well,
You
it's
talk.
it's not even just that you haven't told those stories, and I understand why some of those stories haven't been told. They're so painful, and you're escaping a totalitarian regime, and all you wanna do is try to find peace and safety, and who can you trust? So I understand. I think the Soviets in this country may not have told as many stories as they should have either, but it's completely understandable. But the problem is when these stories are not told, that leaves a vacuum, and the malignant actors get to tell their stories unchallenged. And that was my
Yes.
greatest fear here. I mean, Randy Weingarten came up with a book in September of last year,
Yeah,
you
I
know,
saw that.
and she's constantly in the news. She's, got unlimited resources in terms of going in front of every single mainstream news host and stuff. And what have we got? Even with this tiny little film, it's hard, but at least there's something out there. There's a counter narrative. Otherwise, these liars, these charlatans go unchallenged.
I wouldn't say it's a tiny little film. It's a
Mhm.
powerhouse of a film, and I felt the emotions when I was watching it. I noticed Randy Weingarten last year. I know she was wearing an American flag pin, and she was saying, "Well, I'm a patriot." And I was like, "Oh my god, she just follows, she just kind of follows whatever way the wind blows." And like, and before she was blasting the United States, and now she's like saying, "No one can take my patriotism away from me," is really disturbing. It's
They're
really disturbing.
weaponizing. They're weaponizing American values and our trust, right? America, in my opinion, is a very naive, trusting country. We've never really fought a war on our own land. I mean, 9/11. I mean, but it wasn't exactly a war, and the war went overseas. I think Americans are incredibly sheltered and have really prospered. It's a very prosperous, very coddled country in some ways, and our youth are extremely coddled. And I think when you have actors like Randy Weingarten or Bernie Sanders or all of these, fake patriots trying to weaponize American values, it's very disturbing. And honestly, watching them and seeing how they act and what they say, I have to wonder if their allegiance is actually to another foreign power, not our own.
The one war we did fight on our own land was the Civil War. And I think that's really beautifully illustrative of how we can have not resolved things, can't discuss, and we can really be at war with elements of our own population against, like, with regard to basic ideas that should be common sense, right? Back then
Mhm.
it was slavery, and now it's protect our children. And you can't sacrifice the children to save adults.
But she
Uh,
wouldn't say that she sacrificed anyone at this point. There's no admission of any sort of guilt. I'm not even sure she recognizes it because she's told herself so many lies. She'll say, "I was keeping them safe. I
yeah.
was keeping them safe."
Yeah. I think Tracy Beth Hogue or somebody was at a talk with her, and she was saying, well, we followed the guidance that we were getting, you know? It wasn't me. I was
Right,
making decisions
right.
based on what somebody else told me. You talked about your parents and your experience under Soviet rule. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about the warning signs that you were seeing during COVID that you recognized because of your experience living in a state that had a lot of control and rule, things like parental authority or information control. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, mostly for me, it was the propaganda. It was hard to know what information we were not getting because we weren't getting it. But obviously, the information was available because you and I and many of our friends that we've met through this horrible experience were able to get information if we were resourceful enough and dug and looked in foreign press or whatever it was. But what I saw was this bizarre conformity of thought, this kind of self censorship, a crazy kind of tribalism, a fear of stepping out of line or saying the wrong thing, this like very heightened, almost political correctness that was applied to the virus. Also, this way they segmented people. The way, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the clean and the dirty. I remember there was a time in New York City's history just a few years ago where they required vaccine passes to go into
Yeah.
even any public space. And I remember my neighbor downstairs going, I feel so safe. We went to dinner at a restaurant on the corner last night. And I said, I don't think this is a good idea. Well, why not? And I said, I don't think it's going to work to segregate people this way. And the way it creates a very, very difficult relationship. And there's the clean, the dirty, the good, the bad. I said, it almost reminds me of like a Nazi Germany. Like, what am I going to do? Wear a yellow star? And she was horrified that I had said that. It had never even occurred to her. A very, very smart older woman who just kind of looked at me puzzled and walked on. So just that separation, the isolation, the people as viruses, like children were being treated like they were contagions, like roaches to be avoided. All of that felt foreign. I'd never experienced anything like that in this country. And it was vaguely familiar based on what I'd read about the Holocaust or my parents' experiences as Jews in the Soviet Union. So the tones were there. It took a while to really fully understand it. And but probably by the fall of 2020, I was starting to really see that logic, reason, facts, data, the actual science weren't going to work.
Wow. So, what was it like for you guys early on with the whole pandemic and the lockdowns as a family? How was that experience for you as a family in New York?
Well, we live in about 950 square feet, so it was tough. We figured it out. We left for a while. My kids were still very young and needed space. I certainly wasn't going to socially isolate. I wanted to make sure that they were outside. They were playing in the park and walking around. And we managed to get a dog. It was hard to find a dog during the pandemic. By September of that year, we were able to rescue a dog. I felt like they were being deprived of essential humanity, like different aspects of their humanity were being stripped of them. So, consciously or unconsciously, I was trying to figure out what I could replace them with when those things were being stripped away. So, spending more time outdoors, playing with anyone who would have us, whether it was inside or outside, traveling as much as we could. We got a car and were able to go and spend time, at the beach, at the park, places that were still open. And I think in some ways, I think the dog was actually incredibly helpful because they had
We
wanted a
almost got
dog.
a dog. We almost got a
Yeah.
dog and then we didn't get a dog, but you said the dog was helpful. Why?
Well, I mean, I think that the tactile, like the being together with another being who is not aware of anything, like and perfectly
Yeah,
happy, nothing has happened for the dog. So
right.
that dog is now with you, and whether you like it or not, or you're consciously thinking you're in the space of the dog, you're playing with the dog, you're in the moment, and they're loving and warm, and no dogs don't ever treat humans as pariahs. So that was helpful. We also for a little while, both of my kids were taking piano lessons, and their piano teacher happened to live across the street. And to his credit, he allowed them both to continue to come in person. They were masked, which was pretty awful, but it was
Yeah.
still, as I watched, especially my younger daughter, who was 5 or 6 at the time, sit on a bench with the teacher in person in an embodied experience, being able to, make mistakes or make beautiful music together. I felt like whether she knew it or not, it was very healing and it
Yeah.
established normalcy.
Yeah.
So anything I could, the way I saw it, and I think the way I see the world in general is like when they take things away from you, claw them back and more.
Claw them back and more. Wow, I love that. So then they weren't in school. So what were you guys doing for schooling?
They did virtual. Our schools in New York City reopened before your schools did. You're in California. In New York City, they shut down in March 2020. They were closed and purely virtual for the first 3 months. My older daughter, who was in third or fourth grade at the time, she did remote learning, which was annoying, but at least, she was competent with the computer. My younger daughter was really not interested in looking into a screen. So I just spent a lot of time outdoors with her. I didn't force her. I didn't want her to cry to look into a screen where nobody cares. Like it's just I said, you don't want to do this, we don't have to do this. So I don't know if you remember, but somebody who did something lovely back then, who is not spoken about often enough, is Mo Willems. How did the
No,
pigeon drive the bus or whatever?
I'm
The
not
book.
familiar with Mo Williams. Mo Willems, tell us.
He's a children's book writer. I'm sure he's probably written stuff for adults too. And he did this beautiful thing. It was so simple. It's probably I didn't grow up watching Mr. Rogers, but I imagine it was inspired by something simple like that, where he had a TV show, I think on PBS or maybe it was online. I don't know. And I think he met with the kids once or twice a week, and he would teach them to draw. He would read the books to them. It was this very simple analog show, and it was so reassuring. Nobody ever talks about him. I was so grateful. It was about 4 weeks, and both of my kids were 100% into it, and when it ended and, he said reassuring things like, "It's going to be fine, I know right now you're stuck at home with your brothers and sisters, but it's going to be fine. I'm here in Brooklyn with my family too," is what he
Wow.
said. And, very calm, very nice, and, at the end, and I actually recorded this, so I have it on my phone. He did his last final episode. There was a parting. He told everyone, I think online on his website, what to bring to the show. And it was a pencil. It was simple things that you didn't have to go out and get. It was a pencil, some tape, some paper, and he taught them how to make like a puppet, a pigeon puppet. And so he left them with something tangible. He couldn't reach across the screens, but he gave them something. And it was lovely. And I have a video of my daughter back then, who was 6, making a song and showing the pigeon. And I think that it showed children, I think, all around the country, that there was somebody who was thinking of them and still willing to relate to them on a completely normal basis.
Wow, that's beautiful. I think that sense of normalcy is something that children absolutely needed, and they weren't getting that from their school system or many school systems, certainly not in California, not in New York, to say, hey, we're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And there's a lot of unknowns with what's going to happen and what other adults are going to choose, but we have this together. And to calm the nervous system of the
Mhm.
child down, to create that physical connection. Outside time in the schools would have been great to do, but the needs of the child got completely lost. And it's beautiful that Mo did that. I just wish other people had been more responsible, people who were actually in charge of the children's education and that sense of normalcy, that sense of routine, that rhythm to their days, where instead they were isolated. And you and I also know that child abuse rates went up when you isolate people, get them out of their routines, children and adults, and then you put on top of that financial burdens on the adults, stressors. I had a friend of mine, she's a physician. She said at the beginning of the pandemic, she's like, every other patient I'm seeing, I'm referring to behavioral health. Behavioral health is like mental health services. And she's like, this is ridiculous. Like everybody's stressing out. Like they cannot live near each other to this extent. And I have patients who are husband and wife were just fighting all the time because they're no longer leaving the house. They're not, and so you think about the fighting all the time happening, the child hearing that, and it's just truly, truly frightening. So it was not just a lack of education, it was psychological for a lot of children, not all, but there was a psychological extra burden that they had to carry as a result of their parents and caretakers having to carry that burden, and then it passing on to them either directly or indirectly. The fact that our leaders didn't realize that is truly frightening. And I hope they learn for the future. Your film is something that's going to hopefully show that. It needs to be seen far and wide. This lawsuit about Bill de Blasio, tell us about that.
So in 2021, schools in New York City had reopened for elementary school students, but for middle school and high school students, they were open in a hybrid form, and the kids would come into the schools several days a week. But while they had to wear masks and socially distance, they had to, all these crazy rules that were just made up. They were completely unimpactful. They didn't keep anybody safe. They just kept them isolated, which perhaps they were designed to do. The middle and high school students were back in classrooms, but they weren't back in classroom with teachers. They were back in classrooms with laptops and screens because teachers union contracts kept the teachers out of the classrooms with the students. So they would be teaching potentially from a room in the building, but not in the same room as the kids that they were supposed to be with. And you'd have a non-union employee at the front of the classroom. So as a result, there was a lot of attrition. Why would these middle or high schoolers want to go back to school when their teachers weren't coming back and they were being kept in these very barbaric conditions? And we wanted to make sure that schools would reopen fully as quickly as possible with teachers in the classrooms, full days, because they were pushing the partial remote option for a very long time. And so I tried to find a lawyer. I asked a lot of different firms. Nobody wanted to take the case. And my understanding from parents in other states is that they could not find open schools lawyers. There are very, very few people who are willing to take on these cases.
And that's because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the unions, or they didn't think that they were going to win. Was there any insight
I
on
think
why they didn't want to take these cases?
I think many in the legal profession, unfortunately, are also on the left. And it was seen as a political issue, a left versus right issue instead of a child welfare issue. So law firms refused to even touch these cases. And this was really a uniform situation. I mean, this happens a lot in the legal field. I've spoken to other people who've experienced prosecution by the DOJ and just about how the legal profession is structured, and it is concerning. We found an attorney. He was a medical freedom attorney. His name is Jim Ramiguez. He had sued our governor, Cuomo, to reopen sports clubs, strip clubs, and gyms in New York City and was very successful. The New Yorker even wrote an article about him. I kept harassing him to take this case. And when he heard that these poor kids were still Zooming and a rooming, and there was no public school athletics, like there was nothing for them to do. The libraries were closed, the parks were closed, there was no public school athletics, and all they had was Zoom in a room. I mean, everything was stolen from them. He took the case, and we did a GoFundMe to pay him, and that was very successful very quickly. And I had more plaintiffs than I could handle. I could barely even sift through all the plaintiffs. I had three other moms from New York City help me get the case in order. And then Jim pressed the case. It was like an Article 78. It should have been heard within a couple of weeks. The typical way to hear like an emergency case like that is a couple of weeks. Well, we filed in April 2021 and they didn't hear it till July 28th, 2021. So what's that, 4 months until well after school was out. And at that point, the mayor had said that schools were going to reopen in the fall in full without any special mitigations. I believe maybe masking at that point, but nothing else, which was still crazy. So when we went to court, it was a virtual hearing, which of course is so frustrating. You can't see anyone, you're just hearing disembodied voices. And I mean, the judge, he wasn't going to, rule in our favor anyway. And the city came forward and said, well, if this is an emergency, we still need to have the power to shut things down to keep everyone safe. Look, there are other variants coming down the pipeline. We're okay with opening schools in the fall, but we reserve our rights to reclose them again. And the judge said, well, the evidence in the New York Times says that there are other variants circling. When he said evidence or data or something like that in the
Yeah.
New York Times, I knew we were done. And this is when Apoorva Mandavilli was still the science reporter. I mean, the New York Times was like the biggest rag. That is one of the reasons why we went on as long as we did with the closed schools. And so, but the hearing was important. And the fact that the case had been brought was important. And the fact that the plaintiffs got to share their stories. And we had incredible doctors who gave us expert testimony. We had Dr. Vinay Prasad and Tracy Beth Hogue, and we had education experts from USC. So it was a very important case, and I think it was an important thing to do. And the other thing about that is if I hadn't done it, nobody would have, because it was the only case. It's like you think I'm not going to do this, somebody else will. Well, they didn't. So I did it, and I'm glad I did.
You are a powerhouse. I truly, truly admire you and what you did. And honestly, Natalia, maybe that pressure by bringing about that case put pressure on our lawmakers and our politicians to do something.
Yeah.
What I've learned in my own advocacy is like every little bit counts, and we have to each do our part to put that pearl on that string. And eventually you can get a beautiful necklace.
Continue to speak the truth. I mean, I just read a really great article this morning by Michael Oren in the Free Press talking about the truth being the casualty in this war, and all the blood libels that have been brought against Jews in Israel. And no amount of data, he says, he's not able to convince even his previous allies with data, with reference points, because people get so swept up in these panics and these, propagandistic campaigns. But at the end, he said, and I agree with him, he said, but what can we do? We have to keep speaking the truth and
Absolutely.
bringing it back to the truth. And we may feel like we're just little pebbles. Like he had a great analogy. He said something like, it may feel like we're shooting ping pong balls at a cannon, but every single one of those ping pong balls counts. So I choose to be a ping pong ball.
Well, I am super excited about this film, what you're going to do in the future. I know you're working on other projects too, so I'm super excited to see those in the future. The film is called 15 Days, The Real Story of America's Pandemic School Closures. You can watch it on Apple TV, Amazon Prime, Google, YouTube TV. What are you trying to do for this film now?
I'm trying to raise money so that we can get the word out and make sure that people actually know it's there. It's kind of like having a book in the library, but it's like it's not promoted at the front. It's nobody knows. It's just on a shelf in the back. So trying to market the film and also help host screenings. I mean, we've done about 14 screenings now around the country. I just did the tally this afternoon and was kind of shocked. And I think we're doing this on our own. There's no distributor, there's no funder behind us. It's just a small nonprofit called Restore Childhood. And I'm not going to give up. I'm going to make sure that parents around the country see this film. So anyone who wants to support this would be supporting that effort, the direct to parents pipeline.
So people can watch the movie, they can donate to Restore Childhood to get this film seen around the world by adding to your promotional fund and share it with people, do screenings. You're looking to raise $50,000, I understand,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
do advertising, marketing, promotion. And tell us about this digital archive that you want to create as well.
Oh, yes. I forget about that sometimes. So we did about 60 interviews over the course of, a couple of years. But it was cheap. Like it was me and Stephanie and a couple of good cameras and sound. And so the number of interviews we were able to feature in the film, and obviously the length is extremely, extremely edited. Jay Bhattacharya gave us so much of his time. There's so much more of his story that I would like to share. A lot of parents we spoke with, kids. We also interviewed people like Aaron Cariotti and spent time with Scott Atlas. Eli Steele went to Northern California to Stanford to interview Scott Atlas. We had these incredible histories and nearly 60 interviews. We probably only used maybe 20 in 15 days. So my idea was that we would create a digital archive, like a living museum that everybody could always reference. So when they looked at pandemic school closures, they would, hear Michael Pinckney's story in full about how he was a public school student and his father spent all that time taking him, to meets so he could become a UCLA star athlete now, or, Jay Bhattacharya's story of coming to the United States from India and spending his entire life on the Stanford campus, and then eventually finding that the students and the faculty that he had trusted turned against him,
Oh,
and there
yes.
were death threats. So
Super disturbing story.
these
Yeah.
these stories, I mean, in the film, we're trying to tell a cohesive story of the school closures, but we also talked about the mandates and masking toddlers and all of that. And I have all those stories. I have a lot of interviews, and so we need to edit them and get them onto a website where people can really interact with them and breathe them.
You might also think about submitting to the Library of Congress some of these interviews, especially since Jay is now the head of the NIH. Having that many hours of the head of the NIH on film on tape is something that the Library of Congress should be interested in. I mean, it would be irresponsible of them not to, because I know they, at a certain point, were working to collect COVID stories, and we need to make sure that the stories that they got actually evenly
Yeah.
represent what people actually thought as opposed to one certain narrative. So we're going to link the film's website and the trailer and the donation link to the nonprofit and your social media handles. So tell our audience where people can find you.
So they can find me at 15daysfilm.com, and it's 15daysfilm.com. Everything is there.
And then your social media handles, if they want to find you on social media.
Yeah, on Twitter, it's at Restore Childhood, but it's missing the first E, so it's R Store Childhood. We also have a Substack. It's all linked on our X. So, or you can email me at natalia@restorechildhood.com if you can't find any of this stuff.
And we'll put all the handles and the link to the website for the film and the link to donate and the link to watch the trailer on our show notes so people can find you, find out about the film. Natalia, you are a powerhouse, and I am
Who are you?
I am so glad we have you in our corner. And thank you for all that you do for chronicling what happened to our children and also actively advocating and fighting in our legal system for our children. Thank you for that. And people got to support you. They've got to, because you are one of our warriors. Thank you.
Thank you, Azadeh. So are you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody. And we'll see you guys next time.